It lunged at Harold, forcing the dog back, then turned toward Crowmain. Byron drew up the rifle and took careful aim down the steel barrel. Remembering the safety, he switched it off. Cole unsnapped the frame backpack and drew out Harold's rope and collar. He edged towards his dog. Crowmain advanced, shouting in his native tongue, "Risa! Heimtul! Heimtul!" and waving his blade. The griffin shrank back before him until it curled directly atop the horse's corpse, hissing at him angrily. It hesitated, indecisive for a moment, as if it might take flight, but then it sprang. Crowmain brought his blade down on its forearm with force, but its momentum bowled him over and he cried out in pain. The beast brought its head up, opened its yellow beak to strike, and Byron pulled the trigger. The crows all flew higher, screaming. Byron fell backwards and the griffin screamed, lurching to the side. Crowmain scrambled out of range, his left arm bleeding profusely. The griffin turned to Byron and advanced. Harold's growling and barking intensified. Cole started shouting. Byron scrabbled back, his broken arm tingling inside the cast. Either the recoil or the fall tweaked it. He shifted his grip on the rifle to use the butt end as a club if he needed to, and he rose to one knee. The griffin lunged a second time. Byron fell again, holding it back with the rifle sandwiched in his beak. It struggled to bite him. Harold leaped at it, snapping at its legs. Crowmain stood unsteadily and lifted his sword. Cole went for the hatchet from the bag. The crows flew back and forth, jabbering. And just at that moment, over the corpse of the fallen horse vaulted a red-coated officer on a black stallion. The stallion came to a halt and reared. Using his knees to steady his mount, the officer drew a well-oiled revolver from a holster on his belt, took careful aim, and fired. Shot after shot echoed in the clearing. Smoke blew from the revolver, and the griffin shuddered again and again, screaming until the fifth and final bullet had driven into it. Then the officer discarded his pistol, drew a curved saber, and leapt from his horse, landing gracefully on the dusty ground. He took 3 strides toward the wounded animal and made a surgical thrust, his arm raised and curved sword inverted to stab the creature deep along the neck. The griffin, already shuddering, gave a final muscular surge, then lay still. The officer drew out a handkerchief, calmly wiped down his blade, sheathed it, then offered a hand to Byron. "Lieutenant Arthur Rochester at your service," he said in an aristocratic English accent. "Are you hurt?" "No," Byron said. "I'm fine, thank you, but Crowmain isn't." He gestured toward the injured warrior. "Indeed," Rochester said, glancing toward Crowmain. "You travel with a native?" "We met him at breakfast," Cole said, stepping forward. He held out his hand. "Colton Oakes, this is my brother Byron." Rochester shook it, a good firm handshake, like his father always taught him to give. "Strong English name, Oakes." Rochester nodded approvingly. "But your accents aren't exactly Oxfordshire." "We're Americans," Cole replied. "Ah, Yanks! That is what they call you, isn't it?" Rochester smiled invitingly, his blue eyes twinkling. He removed his white campaign helmet and mopped his blonde hair. "I was unaware that any of your descent were in these territories." Byron left them and walked over to Crowmain, who gazed warily at Rochester while applying pressure to a series of parallel gashes on his left forearm. They were deep, and Byron could see hints of bone at the bottom. Blood seeped through Crowmain's thick fingers. Clearly, it would require stitches. "Let me tend to those," Byron said, trying to remember his first aid classes from scouts. With lacerations and no help coming, they needed to apply even pressure, and if the bleeding didn't stop, and it wouldn't, he'd need to sew them closed. He had a needle and a thread in his pack, but wounds of this depth might do better with fishing line, he thought. They need to be sterilized, too. "Come with me," he ordered. He led the way toward their pack. Harold loped over, tail wagging. "Good boy," Byron smiled. He opened his pack and rummaged through, removing the sewing needle, fishing line, first aid kit, zip ties, and a pair of fleece pajama bottoms. He tied the line to the needle and opened an alcohol pad, rubbing it down. "This'll hurt," he told Crowmain. "Sit here." Crowmain sat. Cole and Rochester walked over to watch. Byron took up the needle and thread. He hesitated. "We need to clean this," he said. "Anyone have alcohol?" Will this do? Rochester produced a silver flask from his breast pocket. "It's gin." "It'll have to," Byron replied. "Thanks." He carefully dribbled it into the wound, and Crowmain, who had all this time been eyeing Rochester with suspicion, grunted and closed his eyes. Byron then began to sew up the gashes with quick and measured motions. "This won't heal pretty," he said, wincing as he worked. His fingers shook and smeared alcohol and blood. "And you'll have to cut this line out when it heals, but it should heal." Byron felt incredibly nervous doing this work and a bit nauseated, but he kept it together as best he could, covering his nerves with conversation. After sewing the wound, he used a pocket knife to cut a leg from the flannel pajama bottoms, and tightly wrapped the arm. Then he secured it snugly with 3 zip ties, trimming the ends with the knife. Rochester bent down and with perfectly manicured fingers picked up a discarded zip tie end from the ground, examining it. "And what is this material?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Plastic," Cole answered, "a petroleum derivative." "Indeed. Yankee ingenuity, I suppose." As Rochester pocketed it, a noise from behind them drew their attention. A file of red-coated soldiers strode out of the woods, marching at the double-quick, and followed by a troop of red-crossed skeletons. "Ah," Rochester smiled, "if you'll excuse me." He strode over toward the leader, a brown-mustachioed and thickly sideburn man of about 40 who wore stripes on his arm. "Sergeant," he said loudly, "take these people into custody. Treat them kindly and with respect. If, he repeated the word with emphasis, "they do as you tell them." "Yes, Lieutenant. Very good, sir." The sergeant moved toward them, followed by his men. Rochester turned to look after them. "I'm sorry about this, chaps," he said, looking at Cole and resuming his conversational tone. "But you are in Her Majesty's lands without authorization, so I must take you back to Fort Douglas for questioning. I promise you safe conduct if you cooperate. I am a man of honor and shall keep to my word." Cromane stood, his hand on his sword hilt and his eyes defiant. The bulky sergeant stepped toward him. "Now, sir, be kind enough to hand that over like a good gentleman," he said, polite, but with an edge of danger in his voice. He and Cromane stared at each other pretty fixedly for a tense few moments before the native warrior wordlessly unbuckled and handed over his sword. "Stephen," Rochester said, turning to a small, brown-skinned man in a black bowler hat and suit who skulked in the shadows behind the skeletons. The man stepped forward. "Can you reanimate a griffin?" The man shook his head. "No, sir. It lacks intelligence and life to be controlled in death." Rochester nodded absently. "The pity," he said, then turned to his soldiers. "Brewster," he ordered, "cut off its head and talons. We'll bring them back as gifts to the Lord Douglas. Then dispose of the corpse. Hutchins," he faced another, "start a cook fire so we'll be ahead of the game when the baggage ponies arrive. Godfrey, go through their things and report to me. And James, butcher that horse. We'll have fresh meat this noon. And, Sergeant..." "Sir," the sergeant answered, clicking his heels together in salute, "put a guard on that Cromane chap. He makes me nervous." The sergeant saluted and assigned a rifled guard with a fixed bayonet to stand watch near Cromane, who sat cross-legged at the base of a tree, his eyes closed and pained, weary expression on his face. The rest of the soldiers went about their business, and soon the clearing was bustling with activity. Cole looked to Byron and raised his eyebrows. The thought passed clearly but silently between them. What were they to do now?